Marcus Hill, a father of two who owned a small grocery store, thought the arrival of the National Guard would finally bring safety to his crime-ridden neighborhood. Angela Torres, a journalist chasing the truth, believed their presence would uncover corruption instead of feeding it. And Sergeant Daniel Cross, a decorated soldier leading the crackdown, carried ambitions that went far beyond restoring order. Their lives collided in a storm of power, fear, and betrayal as the city transformed into a battlefield where protectors became predators. This is the story of how hope turned into horror and how the National Guard grew hungry for far more than justice. The city was restless, simmering with tension that no one could ignore. For years, crime had built up like pressure inside a sealed container, waiting for the moment to burst. Murders were no longer shocking. They were expected, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Robberies happened in broad daylight, and gangs moved with a confidence that mocked the police. Drug wars painted neighborhoods with blood, and each sunrise brought news of another life cut short. It wasn't just crime, it was chaos, spreading like a disease that infected every street, every alley, and every home. The people had grown tired of living in fear, but at the same time, they had grown numb to it, resigned to a life where danger was as ordinary as the air they breathed. When the government announced the arrival of the National Guard, the city erupted with mixed emotions. Some saw it as the last chance to restore order, a bold move to crush the lawlessness that had spiraled out of control. Others feared it was an overstep, a desperate show of force that would only deepen the wounds already festering. Yet no one could deny the spectacle that followed. Armored vehicles rolled down the main streets, their presence heavy and unyielding. Soldiers in full gear marched with precision, their boots striking the pavement in a rhythm that echoed like a warning. Helicopters hovered above, casting shadows over rooftops as if watching every move the city dared to make. For many, there was relief in the sight of authority finally reclaiming the streets. Families peeked from behind curtains, whispering that maybe, just maybe, they could live without fear again. Shop owners reopened their doors with a newfound sense of security, and for the first time in months, children played outside. The gangs that had once swaggered openly now hid in corners, watching carefully, unsure of how far the soldiers would go. Crime rates dropped almost overnight, and the media celebrated the crackdown with glowing reports and bold headlines. It was painted as a victory, the kind of turnaround that politicians dreamed of. But beneath the praise and optimism, there was an uneasiness, a silent question lingering in the back of every mind. Power once seized rarely comes without a price. The National Guard had arrived as saviors, but their eyes carried something more, a hunger that went beyond law and order. The city had invited them in with open arms, unaware that this was not just a mission to restore peace. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, a story that would twist in ways no one could yet imagine. At first, the presence of the National Guard was celebrated as a turning point. News cameras captured smiling families standing outside their homes, reporters spoke of hope returning, and officials praised the sudden drop in crime. The gangs that had once ruled the alleys seemed to vanish, their grip loosening as patrols spread through every corner of the city. Curfews were enforced, checkpoints were built, and with each passing day, the city looked more disciplined, more controlled. Streets, once choked with fear, were quiet, and for a moment, people allowed themselves to believe that safety had returned. But behind the polished image of order, shadows began to stretch longer. Whispers of unusual behavior spread among the residents. At small convenience stores, owners began noticing that soldiers took food without paying, brushing off the protests with the weight of their authority. Farmers who delivered supplies to the markets complained about missing stock. Trucks emptied in the night under the watch of men in uniform. At first, these stories were dismissed as rumors, the kind of grumbling that followed any new authority. Yet they multiplied, and soon entire neighborhoods whispered of soldiers who weren't just enforcing the law, they were feeding themselves at the expense of the very people they were sent to protect. The reports of disappearances added a new layer of fear. Families noticed loved ones missing after late-night raids, their names never appearing in arrest records or police logs. Mothers waited at precincts for answers that never came, while officials quietly insisted the missing were likely tied to gangs. The explanations sounded hollow, especially when respected community members with no criminal ties began vanishing as well. Some believed the Guard was targeting those who resisted, others feared something worse, that the force sworn to protect had grown hungry for power, for control, and perhaps even for revenge against the city they had been sent to tame. The media, once eager to praise the crackdown, hesitated to cover these troubling signs. A few journalists attempted to investigate, but their reports were quickly buried or dismissed as unfounded. Still, the stories circulated in hushed tones at dinner tables, in crowded buses, and inside corner shops. The fear that once came from gangs was now shifting, taking on a new face. The enemy no longer lurked in alleys or on street corners. It wore uniforms, carried rifles, and stood guard under the banner of protection. The line between savior and oppressor was beginning to blur, and the city could feel it tightening like a noose. The first undeniable crack in the guard's image appeared when investigators stumbled upon an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It had once been used by gangs to store stolen goods, but now it served a different purpose. Inside, rows of crates were stacked high with confiscated electronics, jewelry, cash, and weapons. At first glance, it looked like a successful seizure, proof of the guard's efficiency. But the deeper investigators looked, the clearer the truth became. The items weren't logged, there were no official records of the operation, and evidence of recent activity filled the space. Expensive liquor bottles, luxury cars parked outside, and remnants of wild celebrations revealed that the warehouse had been transformed into a private playground for the very men meant to enforce the law. The discovery spread quietly at first, known only among a few officials who dared to speak about it. Soon, however, residents noticed patterns that confirmed their worst fears. Soldiers had been raiding homes and businesses not only to seize contraband, but also to line their own pockets. Missing electronics were sold on the black market. Stolen cash disappeared without a trace, and drugs once meant to be destroyed were now fueling hidden parties deep within guarded compounds. The gangs that had once terrorized the city had been replaced, their roles taken over by men in uniform who had access to heavier weapons, stronger authority, and no one above them willing to intervene. For the citizens, this shift was terrifying. The guard had silenced the gangs but replaced them with a new predator. Neighbors spoke in whispers about the sounds of laughter and music spilling out from the warehouse late at night, a mocking reminder that corruption had merely changed uniforms. Families who had believed the crackdown would bring peace now understood they were caught in the middle of something far more dangerous. This was no longer about restoring order. It was about feeding greed. The media tried to dig deeper into the story, but intimidation quickly followed. Journalists who asked too many questions were suddenly reassigned. Their reports never aired. Whistleblowers vanished, their voices silenced before they could reveal what they knew. In a city that had once prayed for safety, a new realization settled heavily over everyone. The guard wasn't there to protect them. They were there to consume everything they could take, leaving behind only fear. And as each day passed, it became harder to tell whether the city had truly been saved or if it had simply been conquered. The illusion of control shattered when a series of unexplained fires tore through the city. They began in neighborhoods known for resisting the guard's presence, places where residents had spoken out against raids and questioned the disappearances. Entire blocks were reduced to ash overnight, leaving families homeless and terrified. Official statements quickly blamed the gangs, claiming the blazes were acts of retaliation. Yet survivors told a different story. They described seeing armored vehicles stationed near the flames, soldiers watching as buildings collapsed, their silhouettes framed by the inferno. No arrests were ever made, no gang members were found nearby, and the evidence was always conveniently destroyed in the blaze itself. The fires were only the beginning. Power outages struck selectively, targeting areas where journalists lived or where community leaders had voiced opposition. Surveillance cameras were mysteriously disabled before incidents occurred, leaving no recordings behind. Slowly, the city began to realize that what was happening was not the desperate backlash of criminals, but a calculated campaign of intimidation. Each fire, each blackout, each sudden disappearance carried the same message: resistance would not be tolerated. The guard was no longer a force of protection, but one of domination, erasing anyone who dared to question their authority. Rumors spread like wildfire, filling the silence left by censored news reports. Some whispered that the guard was cleansing the city, not of gangs, but of entire communities they considered troublesome. Others believed it was a strategy to claim land, burning out residents so property could be seized without a fight. Families who had once welcomed the soldiers now packed their belongings in fear, fleeing before they too were swallowed by the campaign of destruction. Streets that had briefly felt safe turned into ghostly ruins, scarred by blackened shells of buildings and the lingering stench of smoke. Journalists who tried to investigate met grim fates. Some received threats that forced them into hiding, while others simply vanished, their work erased as though it had never existed. A few daring reports slipped through, but they were quickly dismissed as conspiracy theories by officials who insisted the Guard's mission was a success. Yet the truth lived in the eyes of the people who had lost everything. The crackdown had not brought justice but terror. The city, once broken by crime, was now being reshaped by fire and fear. What had begun as a promise of safety had transformed into something far more sinister, a warning that the hunger for control was only growing stronger. By the time federal investigators were sent to examine the situation, the city was already scarred beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, stripped of life and hope. Families who had survived the fires and raids carried only silence, too afraid to speak about what they had witnessed. Official reports painted the crackdown as a resounding success, highlighting plummeting crime rates and the restoration of order. But beneath the polished numbers and carefully crafted statements, the truth was buried under ashes, intimidation, and fear. What investigators uncovered was only fragments, traces of missing citizens, evidence of stolen goods rerouted through hidden networks, and testimonies that never made it into the public record. The deeper they dug, the more the trail disappeared. Files went missing from government archives, key witnesses vanished before they could testify, and evidence was mysteriously destroyed in accidents. It was as if the city itself was being rewritten, its recent history erased piece by piece. The Guard began to withdraw just as questions grew louder, their mission declared fulfilled. They left in armored columns, faces hidden behind helmets, carrying with them the unshakable aura of power. The people watched in silence, unsure if they were witnessing an end or merely the beginning of something larger. When the soldiers departed, they left behind a city that no longer trusted its own reflection. Gangs were weaker, yes, but the cost of that victory was staggering. Homes were lost, lives had vanished, and a chilling uncertainty lingered over every street. The once hopeful citizens had learned a cruel lesson. The line between protector and predator could vanish in an instant. The Guard had come hungry for justice, but what they consumed was far greater wealth, land, and silence. Even as whispers of corruption reached the national stage, the story was quickly drowned out by other headlines. No one in power wanted to peel back the layers of what had happened. The official narrative remained untouched, a dangerous city tamed by decisive force. But those who had lived through it knew the truth. They carried memories of armored vehicles parked in the smoke, of burning homes, of neighbors taken and never returned, of soldiers feasting on the spoils of their raids. The city never received justice, only scars. And in the quiet aftermath, one haunting thought remained: if the Guard could do this here, what would stop them from doing it again somewhere else? The hunger for power never ends, it only waits for its next meal.